We're going to continue our study of Shabbos. At the end of last week's shir, we began with a new sugya about what's called Tosefes Shabbos, and we left it hanging. I asked a question, called it a cliffhanger, and I worked on this question for a long time, couldn't come up with an answer, but I found an answer here. So let's go over the question. You'll see it if you have your pages. It's called Siman Kuf Yud Beis, and it appears here on page Reish Tzadi Ches, which they switch around to Reish Ches Tzadi. So that means it's page 298. The question that we asked last week, and let's review it, is based on Rashi in the Shulchan Aruch. The Rashi appears in Shabbos on Daf Ches Amud Beis, and Rashi's interpreting the Gemara about Rebbe. Rebbe says, and he makes a flat statement, that whatever the Chachamim prohibited, Mishum Shvus, on Shabbos is mutter b'bein hashmashos. Lo gazra le b'bein hashmashos, that means that I'd be allowed during bein hashmashos to violate any shvusim. And Rashi explains why. Rashi says that since bein hashmashos is safek, therefore we apply the principle of safek d'Rabbanan l'kula. So if let's say I have an Isa Shvus of, let's say, Hatmana, I'm allowed to do Hatmana on bein hashmashos, says Rashi, because I'm going to apply the principle of safek d'Rabbanan l'kula. Since bein hashmashos is a safek, and Hatmana is an Isa d'Rabbanan in the worst case scenario, meaning even if I assume that bein hashmashos l'chumra is Shabbos already on Friday, nevertheless, I only violate maximum an Isa Shvus d'Rabbanan of Hatmana. And therefore, I'm going to apply the principle of safek d'Rabbanan l'kula. That's how Rashi interprets the Shita of Rebbe. Rebbe is based on Hilchos Sfeikos. Now again, this is Rashi's approach. In fact, the Rambam has a different approach. We'll get to that later on in Mitzvah Shem, but within the context of Rashi's approach, that the heter of Shvusim, according to Rebbe Ben Hashmashos, is an application of the general rule of Safek d'Rabbanan l'kula, because every Shvus is only d'Rabbanan, and Ben Hashmashos is Safek. This finds its expression in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch, we'll take a look in just a minute, is going to wonder what happens in a case where I want to do an Eruv, which is a Shvus d'Rabbanan, or for that matter, Atmana, during the period of Tosefes Shabbos. And the Shulchan Aruch says that it depends. If the Tzibur had recited Baruch Hu, that constitutes a Kabbalas Shabbos of the Tzibur. You are no longer bound, you're no longer free, I should say, to decide for yourself when you want to be Makabel Shabbos. You are now Kafuf L'Tzibur. And once the Tzibur was Makabel Shabbos, that's Mechayev you as a Yochid. A lot of people don't know this, but that's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. You'll see it in Siman Reish Samach Alf. I actually have the Shulchan Aruch here on the table. I'll just read it to you. Shulchan Aruch writes at the end of Siman Reish Samach Aleph, Achar Anias Baruch Hu, Afal Pisha Dain Yom Hu, it's still daylight. Ema Arvin V'Ein Tomnin. Bishum Dehu Kibla L'Shabbos Aleh, which means whether he likes it or not, he has already been Makabel Shabbos. And he goes on to offer another possibility that Mizmor Shel Yom HaShabbos is when we're Makabel Shabbos. But be that as it may, once there's Kabbalah Shabbos, Shulchan Aruch paskins, I'm enjoined from ma'arvin or tomnin from any shvus, they're rabbanon. Let's try to understand the logic that compels the Shulchan Aruch. You cannot apply the principle of Safek Rabbanon L'Kula here. Why? Because Kabbalah Shabbos is Vada. It's not a Safek. You can talk about Bein HaShmashos without Kabbalah Shabbos. And that can be an objective Safek. We don't know if it's Laila, if it's Yom. But once there's Tosefes Shabbos with a Kabbalah, then Shabbos is Vada. It's no longer Safek. In fact, Tosefes Shabbos is Doraisa. The Gemara in Masechta Beitza learns it from V'nisam Esnafshel Seichem, Ba'erev, Bachi Ba'erev, and Shabbos like Yom Kippurim requires a Kabbalah's Tosefes Shabbos. Once I'm a Kabbalah Shabbos, it's Shabbos. Amir Shabbos, it's Shabbos for me. You know the famous story of the Brisker Rav on his way to Palestine. Before the establishment of the state, he came by train. The last stop was, before Israel, was Turkey. And they rolled into the station in Turkey a few minutes before Shkia. So the Brisker Rav had all his passport and everything else in his pocket. He threw everything up in the air in the train, and he screamed, Bamir Shabbos. For me, it's Shabbos. That's what Tosefes Shabbos is. Once I'm a Kabbalah Shabbos, it's Shabbos for me. So Shulchan Aruch is a expression of a compelling logic that once I was part of the Tzibur and I answered Baruch Hu, which constitutes a Kabbalah Shabbos, then there's no heter, not for Tomnin, not for Eruv, and that's true for all Shvusim. So you see that the Shulchan Aruch is approaching it from the perspective of Kabbalah Shabbos, otherwise known as Tosefes Shabbos, is Vada. It's not a Safek. I can't apply Safek Rabbanon L'Kula once I accepted Shabbos. If that be the case, how do we understand Rashi and Rebbe? Rebbe says that Bein HaShmashos is Mutar B'chol HaShvusim. How can it possibly be Mutar B'chol HaShvusim? By definition, Bein HaShmashos is part of Tosefes Shabbos. You know, you can be Makabel Shabbos early, let's say after Paga Mincha, whatever it might be. But let's say you want to be Makabel Shabbos the very last possible moment. It's got to be before Shkia. It's got to be before Bein HaShmashos. The latest time for Kabbalah Shabbos would be a minute before Bein HaShmashos. So Bein HaShmashos, by definition, falls in that time period of Kabbalah Shabbos, of Tosefes Shabbos. And the Shulchan Aruch paskins that once there was Kabbalah Shabbos, then you cannot violate even the Rabbanans. No Ma'arvin and no Atmana. What sense can we make out of Rebbe, who says that there's no Isur Shvus during Bein HaShmashos? Rashi plugs in because it's Safek Yom, Safek Laila. And when it comes to Shvusim, we'll apply the universal principle of Safek Rabbanon L'Kula. How could that possibly be? And it certainly could not be reconciled with the Shulchan Aruch, who paskins that during Bein HaShmashos, and for that matter, even before Bein HaShmashos, once there was a Kabbalah Shabbos, he's enjoined from the Rabbanans, from Shvusim. So how could Rebbe say, well, during Bein HaShmashos, we're going to apply Safek Rabbanon L'Kula? It's impossible. I'll read to you the sort of the punchline, the summary of the question here at the end of page 298. And again, thanks to David here for sending out the copies. He says, Echi tachein heter shel shmuz bizman ben hashmashos. Afilu kodem ben hashmashos hu vadai Shabbos mikoach Tosefes Shabbos. It's an unbelievable question. And it's so simple. You ask yourself, a kindergarten child should have asked this question. You're talking about Ben HaShmoshes and you're being matir shvusim. It's already past Tosefes Shabbos. Tosefes Shabbos is not something to Rabbanu L'Kula, and I'll prove it to you from the Shulchan Aruch, but I don't even need the Shulchan Aruch. The logic is absolutely compelling. You accept it upon yourself Shabbos, then it's a vadai, not a suffix. In Brisk, they always ask this question. It's a classic chakira. B'toras vadai or b'toras suffix? Like, for example, a carbon Hashem tolu. A carbon Hashem tolu is generated by suffix. I don't know if I ate shuman, I don't know if I ate chalib, but the carbon is brought b'toras vadai. I'm obligated to bring, in that case of a suffix, a carbon Hashem tolu. And it's not a question of maybe yes, maybe no. I'm obligated. The situation, the background of suffix generates a vadai, but I bring it to Torah's vadai. Otherwise, it would be suffix chul and lazor. And the Rav now quotes his father of Moshe Soloveitch. And of course, in typical Brisker style, we need a tzvei dinim. There are two categories, two different dinim that are included in Tosefes Shabbos. Tosefes Shabbos is a general category, but it hides, it sort of camouflages the bifurcation, if I could use that word, the split between two different categories and dinim of Tosefes Shabbos. The first one is very, very familiar to us. We are enjoined from doing malach on Shabbos. A person has to be poresh mi-malach on Shabbos. When is he going to be poresh mi-malach on Erev Shabbos? At what moment in time is he going to decide, I will henceforth desist from involvement in malach? What, is he going to wait until the last minute? He obviously has to start and desist from malacha, which is called prisha mi-malacha, a little bit earlier. And that's when he accepts upon himself Tosefes Shabbos. Rav Moshe says that Tosefes Shabbos is in the Gavra. What does that mean? It's in the Gavra. We'll get to the second category, which is in the Chefza in a minute. He says, Uchiyuv prisha mi-malacha b'shem yaltas. He doesn't actively create something new. He passively abstains from malacha. Once again, a typical brisker chakira. Is it shevi altaseh? Is it kuvaseh? This is shevi altaseh. Says Rav Moshe, he doesn't need a formal kabbalah. Very often we ask ourselves the question, does Tosefes Shabbos require some sort of formal declaration? Hineni muchar mezuman, I am now prepared to be makabel on myself Shabbos. And I got to read a text and say it out loud, and it's got to be, hashmei liyaznam, mashemotza mipicha. Says Rav Moshe, no. All I have to do is desist from malacha. Once I made that decision, that it's about time, when I look at the clock, that I stop getting involved in malacha. In the old days in the agriculture, come back from your farms. You remember all the tekios, the sheish tekiyot. So they blow the last shofar. And now you got to come back from the fields. That itself is Tosefes Shabbos. But that Tosefes Shabbos, we have to emphasize, is b'shem v'altas. It does not require any sort of formal declaration. And he writes that although the Mishnah Brura seems to indicate that a person who wants to be Makabel Shabbos should do so b'dibur, that's l'chora contradiction to Rav Moshe. But we don't find a clear-cut source for this assumption of the Mishnah Brura, that in order to makayim your obligation to Tosefes Shabbos, you need to do so with a verbal declaration, b'dibur. Now, by the way, as we mentioned earlier, the paradigmic case of Tosefes is Yom Kippur. So he starts fasting before Shkia. He enters into the Tainis, the Inui, and he's poresh from Achila, Shasiya, Rechitza, etc., when it's still light out. The sun is not yet set. And the Rishonim vacillate back and forth. How much of a period of time should he allow before nightfall, before Shkia, for Tosefes Yom Kippur? But we're going to study today the Ri'az in the Shiltei Gibora. And again, I'd love you to follow it inside the text if you can. It's on the bottom of the left column on this page at the beginning of Siman Kuf Yud Beis. Because now we're going back to the Rishonim, where you can be very careful and meticulous about reading every word. Umahi ha-Tosefes, asks the Riaz, she'izar min ha-Safek. What's pushing you towards Tosefes? The Safek. You got to be nervous now. It's getting late. He shouldn't do malach again. You know, it's ben hashmashos. You know, it's the sun is setting, twilight, and now he's going to continue doing malacha. Masnil shvisaso miba'od yom. Therefore, even when it's definitely yom and the sun hasn't set yet, he should be involved in shvisa. He should have begun, we call it in football a kickoff. It should have been a kickoff of shvisa. And then he goes on and he says it again when he gets to Yom Kippur, the same idea of starting his shvisa mibod yom. The chayber of Yom Kippur, Yadlik esaner umaskel usanos mibod yom kidei sheyifrosh min hasafek. Rabbi said, did you hear this? This is the Ri'az, quoted in the Shiltei Giborim. I think he was in the about 600 years ago, more maybe. Says the Ri'az, by being parish min hasafek, he fulfills a mitzvah aseh of Tosefes Shabbos. Yesh ba mitzvah aseh kidei shisrachek ha'adam min hasafek. 3 times over, he repeats himself. You hear this, Rabbi? That Tosefes Shabbos equals being parish min hasafek. And by being parish min hasafek, he's mekayim a mitzvah aseh. And he begins his shvisa when it's still day. We see clearly that the Yesod HaYesodos of Tosefes Shabbos, according to the Riaz, is a chovas gavra, to be poresh min hasafek. And now we're ready for category number 2, an entirely different mitzvah of Tosefes Shabbos, which you'll see here on the next page, 299. 5 lines down from the top. Matzinu din nosaf. There's a second category of Tosefes Shabbos. Sha'adam mekabel olav Tosefes Shabbos. And now we need a formal declaration. Did you ever do it? Did you ever have a formal declaration? On Erev Rosh Hashanah, they give me a formal declaration of Hataras Nidar. Where's nobody ever gave me a formal declaration. I should be Makabel Tosefes Shabbos. What is Rav Moshe talking about here? Al Yidei Tefillah, O Amiras Baruch, O Hadlokas Neros. The Oz Chalalav HaShabbos Al Yidei Maisa Shel Kabbalah Shabbos. Mirtzon. Now that we have the second category, we go back to the Shulchan Aruch that we started with, and it sheds a beautiful light, because the Shulchan Aruch is telling you that I don't have to wait for you to be Makabel Shabbos. Once the Tzibur is Makabel Shabbos, and the Shatz recites Baruch Hu, and you answer to the Baruch Hu, you have now linked yourself up with the Tzibur, and now we have what I call a formal Kabbalas Shabbos, in this case through the agency of the Tzibur. So the first difference between these two halachas is Shevi al Taseh versus Kum Vaseh. Whereas the first halacha, which we saw in the Riyaz, is a Shevi al Taseh, to be Poresh Min HaSafek. The second halacha is that I decide with a positive action or a positive declaration that I will be Makabel Shabbos. Now it becomes a Kum Vaseh. It's not just a Shevi al Taseh. So Rav Soloveitchik says, what is the significance, the import, the impact, I would say, of this second Kabbalah Shabbos? What does it accomplish? What does it create that the first halacha of Tosefes Shabbos does not create? A chefts of Shabbos. It's very interesting, because you and I would have said, what do you mean? I was Makabel Shabbos. Let's say my name is Ruben. Shimon was not Makabel Shabbos. So you're telling me that my Kabbalah Shabbos creates a chefts of Shabbos? Well, as far as Shimon is concerned, he was not Makabel Shabbos. So do we have a chefts of Shabbos? But the truth is, it's no different than a neder. The Gemara says at the beginning of Masechta Nedarim that a neder is a chefts d'isura. How can it be a chefts d'isura? I took a neder. For you, it's mutter. For me, it's awesome. So you see that there's such a thing as a subjective chefta. He says the following: Tibechiv Harishon, the first category of being Parish Min HaSafek and Tosefes Shabbos, Ein Hayom Nefach LeShabbos. Bechol Chalos HaTosefes Shabbos Ukiyim Bagavra B'Meshu Monea Uporesh Mimaloch. Okay. Meaning that Tosefes Shabbos in the first category that we mentioned is not more chomer than Ben Hashmashos. It can't be more chomer than Ben Hashmashos. And the first category means I have to be Porish Min HaSafek in the same way that during Ben Hashmashos I have to be Porish Min HaSafek. Well, if I'm being Porish Min HaSafek, that only applies to Malachas D'Oraisa. It does not apply to Shvus D'Rabbanan, because in a case of a suffix like Ben Hashmashos, we can apply the principle suffix D'Rabbanan L'Kula. Lucy will ask me, if that be the case, how could the Shulchan Aruch paskin that during during Tosefes Shabbos, he's enjoined from Erev Chatzeros or from Hatmana, those are only D'Rabbanans. If the Machayev is Safek, the answer is the Shulchan Aruch is talking about the second category of Tosefes Shabbos. And how do I know this? Because the Shulchan Aruch says he heard Baruch Hu. Once he heard Baruch Hu, he's already in the second category. He's already achieved a formal acceptance, Bekum Vaseh, of Shabbos. And that Tosefes Shabbos will generate a chefza shel Shabbos b'toras vadai, not b'toras something. Mela, he's usher even on shvusim derabon. I'm telling you, Rabosa, you could make a birchas hanenim on this, not just birchas haTorah. This is unbelievable. I would have thought about this for a lifetime, never would have come up. He says the following: Al Yidei Maisa, when it's a kuvaseh, a formal Kabbalah Shabbos, etzem hayom nasa cheftel sheyom Shabbos. It becomes a cheftel Shabbos b'toras vada. Whereas the Zman of Bein HaShmoshes is a suffix, but once I have Tosefes Shabbos in the second category of Tosefes Shabbos, then it's b'toras vada. Then I've engendered a chefza shel Shabbos b'toras vadai that encompasses everything, even shvusim d'Rabbanan. Whereas under the first category is the Tosefes, it's just a Chovas Gavra, Prisha Mimalacha, to be Noeg and Isur during this period of time, and that only applies to Vadai, Malacha, but not to the Rabbanans. Ulam and whom a kabbalah of Tosefes Shabbos mirtzona yidei tefila o adlokas neros az a chefta shel azman nefach liyom haShabbos v'avi chefta shel yom haShabbos b'toras vadai v'u nesar b'chol hashvusim kimo b'vadai Shabbos ubazeh din Tosefes shavel lo ha'ikar legamri. Tosefes is exactly identical with the ikar Shabbos. Lifrosh bo beimi malachas doraisa ubeimi kol hashvusim d'Rabbanan. The ayin shel b'shulchan aruch sha'oser b'chol hashvusim b'Tosefes Shabbos hasam mayri b'Tosefes Shabbos ha'yidei amiras baruchu v'hu ma'aseh shel kabbalas Tosefes Shabbos mirtzono davi chefza shel Shabbos b'toras vada. Okay, here Rav Soloveitchik implies, and this is based on the Riyaz apparently, that the Tosefes Shabbos D'Oraisa is only to be porish min hasafek. And therefore, since it's being porish min hasafek, therefore he doesn't have to be porish mi d'Rabbanan, because safek d'Rabbanan. Okay. Now, it's very interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Bobby.
Do you take the analogy to Nadarim, where I can actually usher something on you? So if a wife, for example, lights candles, does that create the issur for the husband? Or if the husband, for example, says Baruch Hu, should that create the issur for the wife? In other words...
That really touches on a different question. Whenever there's a chovas tzibur, does the woman have to be nimshach basa the tzibur, meaning her husband might be the representative of a certain tzibur, like as a bias kind of thing. Maybe, we get to Hanukkah, we can talk about that concept. But I wanted to make a few points over here, because as I told you at the outset, the Rambam has a different approach. But before we get to the Rambam, sometimes you see brackets in the Hare Kedem, and then the bracket starts with Aleph Hey as an abbreviation. Anybody know what Aleph Hey is? Took me years to figure this out. Omar HaKoseh. In other words, this is an edition of the author of this book. Again, the Torah itself is based on Rav Soloveitchik, but he decides when he wants to add something. And I find very often he embellishes it very beautifully. And he writes, there's a Tosefes at the beginning of Arvei Psachim about Tosefes Yontiv on Erev Pesach, whether or not he can fulfill his mitzvah of Achilas Matzah. And it's still light out. And Tosefes actually vacillates about this point. La Alocha, by the way, we pass you have to wait till Vadai Laila. Before the etzem hayom nasa liyotif, according to that side in Tosefes Safek, the day itself becomes Pesach. Otherwise, it's not Chag HaMatzos, and I certainly can't be Mekayim the mitzvah of Achilus Matzah, but Tosefes thinks that maybe I can. It means that Tosefes understood that Tosefes Yontif in this case, and the same would apply by analogy to Tosefes Shabbos, he changes the nature of the day. It becomes a day that's sanctified with the same Kedusha of the 15th of Nisan, even though technically it's only the 14th of Nisan.
Can you extend it to Shabbos? Pesach, Erev Pesach's different because Erev Pesach you have the chiyuv of the Korban Pesach, which gives kedusha to that part of the day, even though it's not night yet. Wouldn't you say it's different?
I hear what you're saying, Joe, but I don't. He says that the Gemara that Tosefes quotes to prove that side that you can eat matzah. Tosefes has a raya from Brachas Chav Zayin about Rav Havitzoli shel Erev Shabbos be'erev Shabbos. The Omar Kiddush Bod Yom. Rav would recite Ma'ariv when it's still light out on Erev Shabbos, and they recite Kiddush. So you see that Tosefes is trying to understand and prove that Tosefes Shabbos creates a Chefetz of Shabbos. And therefore he can recite Kiddush. How do you recite Kiddush when it's still light out and it's Friday, it's not Shabbos? But the answer is that once he's Makabel Tosefes Shabbos, then he changes the Chefetz of the day. And the case of Tosefes is davening Ma'ariv. Rav davened Ma'ariv when it was still light out. And it was an Arvis of Shabbos. So now we get to that second category where through Tefillah, you have a dibur, b'kuvasei, that converts the time period and endows it with the status of Kedusha Shabbos. It's a Chefetz of Shabbos. If it's a Chefetz of Shabbos as far as Kiddush is concerned, Tosefes says the Chefetz of Yontif as far as Matzah is concerned. But now we get to the Rambam. And it's really interesting. The Rambam avoids this whole discussion. How so? Perek of Dalet. Kol advarim she'masurim mishum Shabbos, mishum Shvus, lo gazru aleim ben hashmoshos. The Chachamim put a built-in t'nai, a condition into their enactment of Shvusim. And what was that condition? Lo gazru ben hashmoshos. Ela be'itzumo shel yom. All the Shvusim, says the Rambam, an amazing chiddush of the Rambam, were established for Itzumo Shel Yom, but they left out Bein HaShmoshos. And this is the way, apparently, the Rambam understood Rebbe. That Rebbe says that the Gzeros to Rabbanan don't apply in Bein HaShmoshos. The Rambam is avoiding the whole issue of Safek. He's not applying the principle of Safek Rabbanan L'Kula. He's saying that there was never an Issa Rabbanan during Bein HaShmoshos. As therefore, according to the Rambam, the whole kasha that we ask falls by the wayside. There's no question to ask. Because if you're wondering how Rebbe could be matir Shvusim during a period of time of Bein HaShmoshos, meaning during Bein, which is Tosefes Shabbos by definition, the answer is because Rebbe holds that there's a proviso and a restriction, a limitation in the original takana of all the Shvusim, that the Shvusim were only prohibited during Itzuma Shel Yom, La Fuki Bein HaShmoshos. They left out Bein HaShmoshos. Ulefi said, Nira da Rambam Sprile Keshita Rishona Muveres B'Shulchan Aruch Archaim Shin Sadi Gimel Beis. Echad Eruve Chatzeros v'Echad Shitufei Muvos Ma'arvin Osom Bein HaShmoshos Afilu Im Kvar Kivel Olav Tosefes Shabbos. The Rambam says he was makabel on himself Tosefes Shabbos, and nevertheless he's permitted to set up his Eruv Chatzeros or Shita Muvos during Bein HaShmoshos. How could it be? if he was Makabel Tosefes Shabbos? The answer is the Rabbanan never prohibited Erev Chatzeros or Shita Vuvos during this period of Bein HaShmashos. However, the Shulchan Aruch brings a second opinion, Yesh Osrim Im Kibel Olav Tosefes Shabbos. And that second opinion is codified by the Mechaber in Siman Reish Samach Aleph that we began with, Seif Dal.
I'm sorry, so how does he understand Tosefes Shabbos? What does that mean? The essays and not the los essays?
No, not necessarily. It could be the essays and the los essays, but not shvusim. But again, not because Tosefes Shabbos is in a different world, a different realm. Tosefes Shabbos is in the same world as Shabbos itself. But it's a din in the shvusim. The shvusim were never prohibited during that period of time. The only problem that we're left with, which you'll see here at the end of this essay, is that the Rambam adds a few words. He says, "V'hu sheyeh sham dvar mitzvah o docha." We're not sure why the Rambam adds that limitation, as if to say that if all things were ideal, we would not fall back on this heter and say, well, the Rabbanan never prohibited during Bein HaShmashos. We only do so because the Shas HaChak, or because I have to do a mitzvah, and I need that Erev desperately in order to do the mitzvah. Like the Gemara says in Erevin, he had to go to a bar mitzvah celebration outside the city limits. And look what time it is. It's already Bein HaShmashos, but we're going to allow him for the sake of the bar mitzvah. That's the Rambam's.
I was going to ask that question, whether it's l'chatchila or b'diavad. And in other words, so what it seems to be mashma that the shvus is there. Either you could say that the shvus is there, but you have a heter. That's the way the chachamim set it up. Or you say that the shvus is not there, and then
it's a bit choppy. It was very smooth until the Rambam added that last phrase. If the Rabbanim decided that the mechayev of shvusim is dafka itzumot shel yom, etzem HaShabbos, to say that that's only a fallback position, it gets really sticky. It's not glatt. What I'd like to study with you now, and as I mentioned more than once, we're trying to find a bridge to Hanukkah, because I think it's a little premature, is an essay here at the very end of this volume, which is called VeShamor Zachor. And the reason I'm excited about this is because I'm a little bit familiar with Rav Soloveitchik's approach, and I never quite saw anything similar to this. This is like off to the, veering off the well-trodden path of a Soloveitchik, of a Brisker Lam. He quotes a Ramban ala Torah. And I think I mentioned this Ramban over a decade ago in Clanton Park on Midvale Avenue. They used to call me the Midvale Rebbe. Anyway, so the Ramban says the following. What is Shamar v'Zachor? And he quotes the Sefer HaBahir, which is attributed to one of the Tanoim, Rav Nechunya ben Akon. He says, so gadol v'Zachor v'Shamar. As soon as you see that, you know that in the art school, they're not going to bother translating. Beyond the scope of this elucidation. I know that by heart. All right. Maybe one day art school will do tshuva and they'll finally translate the Rambans that are most important. About 30% of the Ramban al Torah, which they leave out. Anyway, that's just my own axe to grind. I'm not going to tell you about my ashkaf on masks and inoculations. That's too sensitive. But I can talk to you about my criticism of Art School's translation of the Ramban, which, by the way, is an excellent translation. Don't get me wrong. Fantastic piece of work. But it just bothers me. You start a mitzvah, Omer Gemara. They should have finished the mitzvah. Anyway, so what does Rav Nechunya ben Akana say? He wants to divide up Shabbos into two fundamentally different parts. Normally when we talk about Kedushas HaZman, it takes you from the beginning to the end, but not in the case of Shabbos according to the Sod God. We're going to split between the night of Shabbos and the day of Shabbos. The night of Shabbos is a dimension of the feminine, which means Boi Chala is what we recite on the night of Shabbos. And that's based on a Gemara in Bava Kama. People think it's based on the Arizal 5 centuries ago, but it goes back to the Gemara. And the Gemara says, Bo v'neitzei likras Shabbos Malka. Shabbos is identified with a queen. And now the Sefer HaBoyer says, this is pretty revolutionary, that the mitzvah of Zachor es Yom HaShabbos, of Zechira, which is Miloshen Zachor, meaning a male, that's on the day of Shabbos. The night of Shabbos, all right, we recite Kiddush, but that Kiddush is completely focused on Shamar, not on Zachor. So in chronological sequence, you would have to say Shamar v'Zachor b'dibur. Start with Shamar, Shmira, and that's the Bechina of Kala, of a Malka, and that's at night. And then we rise up to the highest level of Kiddush. He calls it Kiddusha Rabbah, that's a Lashon of the Gemara in Pesachim, which is the Kiddush we recite by day. So again, I want to avoid any uncomfortable politics here about people who make Kiddush on schnapps and so forth and so on. I know the whole issue of whiskey in your neighborhood is very questionable in any event. But who doesn't make Kiddush on schnapps on Shabbos, right? That's what you can ask me. Certainly my father made Kiddush on schnapps, and my shver all of a sudden made Kiddush on schnapps. But I'm telling you, it's not so posh. Because Kiddusha Rabbah is called the Great Kiddush. That's the Iker Kiyum of Shira, and it involves the mitzvah of Zechira, which is a mitzvah by day. So what's at night? And we now identify Shamar as the feminine dimension, whereas Zachor is the male dimension, the masculine dimension. My time was Zachor v'Shamar. Zachor liZachor. Zachor es Yom HaShabbos for Zachor, that corresponds to the Zachor, the male. Ushmar lekala, and Shmira is for the Kala. And then he brings a proof from the Zohar. The Zohar says, Minagenu shebalayla hu bechinas shamar, bechinas nekeva v'kala, v'lachein anu omrim v'berchas kedushas hayom v'yanuchu ba mekadshishin. V'yilu bayom shekasabo Zachor es Yom HaShabbos lekadsho bechinas Zachor v'yanu omrim v'yanuchu vo ad shas mincha. And here's a real Kabbalistic concept. Bizman Ra'ua de Ravavin. Rava de Ravavin is the Ratzon Shebertzonos. That's like the highest level you can reach. The Oz Nimzagim Kol Abachinos Yachad Omer V'Yanuchu Vam. So the final integration, the synthesis of Zachor and Shamar, of male and female dimensions of Shabbos, this reaches its apex, its integration, when we reach Rava de Rava, which amongst Hasidim, Shalshudis is like, above the world. He points out that the Rambam doesn't seem to have this approach, because the Rambam says that on Friday night, when we go out to receive the Shabbos, we receive the Melech, not the Malka. So the Rambam, there's a whole issue about whether the Rambam was exposed to the Zohar, whether he studied Kabbalah, he didn't study Kabbalah. Most of the scholars will tell you he had no shaykhus to Kabbalah. This would be a good proof for that, support that position. In any event, so now Rav Soloveitchik takes it upon himself to try to explain this concept of Rav Nechuni ben Akana and the difference between Shamar at night, which is feminine, is Kala, as opposed to Zachor during the day, which is the masculine. I just want to, if you don't mind, I just want to add my own comment to it before we go on. How are we doing on the clock? Oh, not too great. All right, maybe I'll fit it in anyway. I have a time to share this. I find this very strange that the Iker Kiddush is by day, because the mitzvah of Zachor as Yom Shabbos L'Kadsha starts at night, and that's a Doraisa. And in fact, Tosefes and the Rashbam and Psachim say that Kiddush during the day is secondary. And the reason why the Gemara calls it Kiddusha Rabbah is just the Lashon Saginah. And so we shouldn't be mezalzel and insult the Kiddush during the day, but the real Kiddush is at night. And it makes sense because the Kiddush has to be Mekadesh the entire Shabbos. You're not going to start during the day. But I would suggest a little bit of a different approach than what we're going to learn here. When it says that the night of Shabbos is the Bechina of Nekeva, of Shmira, I would suggest that that's from the perspective of the Shabbos itself. Like we said before, there's a Chefetz of Shabbos. The Chefetz of Shabbos on Friday night is in a Nekeva. Why? Because we are obligated as a Zachor in the mitzvah of Zachor as Yom Shabbos L'Kadsha. We sanctify the Shabbos. And even though the Gemara says that Shabbos is Kriya V'Kaima, but nevertheless, we are still obligated to be Mekadesh the Shabbos. At this point, we're not influenced by the Shabbos. It's too early to be impacted by the Shabbos. On the contrary, we are impacting on the Shabbos. And therefore, in the male-female role of Mashpia and Mushpa, of Nosein and Makabel, I would say that Friday night, we are Begeder Notznim, hence the mitzvah of Zachor, and Shabbos becomes the Makabel. Only during the day, once Shabbos has already reached its full bloom, and we are ready to be makabel from the Shabbos, then Shabbos plays the role of a male, meaning of the mashpia. All right, anyway, a lot to think about. Says Rav Soloveitchik, let's talk about the respective roles of the male and the female. And again, we live in an environment where this is not politically correct. Male and female, they're all the same. They all have the same jobs. And, the wives are doctors and psychiatrists and lawyers, and they're making more money than the men. All that stuff, But anyway, the Rav is more of a conservative. He votes Republican. He's back in the old days. So anyway, he says there's a special tafkin on the woman and a special tafkin on the man. The tafkin of the woman is shamar. What does that mean, shamar? Her job is protection. She's got to be like a mother hovering over the little fledgling birds. She has to hover over the bias, the house, the household. And basically, her job is to guarantee that we continue to observe the transmission of all our traditions, of the Mesores of Saba. Al titoch mitoras imecha, to make sure that everything is done Everything is implemented al Taras HaKodesh. He gives the example of this last week's parsha, Sarah, get rid of Yishmael. He's having a negative impact on Yitzchak. Shmira means clear out all those possible influences and make sure that everything is protected. All of Kedusha and sanctity is protected. We find it again with regard to Rivka. Rivka is going to protect Yaakov Avinu from Esau. We find it with regard to Rachel. She's going to steal the Trofim from Beis Lavan. All this is Begeder Shmira, and that's the woman's tafkid. The Gemara says that B'schus Noshim Tzidkanios Yotzu Avoseinu Mitzrayim. It means that the women were in charge of guaranteeing the continuation and the perpetual Masira of the tradition. That's the schus of the Geula. Shabbos has an element of lo taseh, and Shmira is a reflection of protecting Shabbos, that we shouldn't trample and desecrate the sanctity of Shabbos. And in the next paragraph, he addresses the question of what's the tafkid of each. After all, you've given everything to the woman. Save a little for us guys. And he says the following, that the father is in charge of the spiritual training of his son to guarantee the expansion of the bounds of Kedusha, to expand Kedusha. Of mitzuva lomo lespero livdoso lelamdo Torah legadlo lechancho lechakmo lekadsho lamlicho. We are a mamleches kohanim and koi kadosh. It's the responsibility of the father to see to it that the children are projected towards mamleches kohanim and koi kadosh and expand the boundaries of Kedusha. And that's what Zachor is about. Now we're no longer in the realm of VeShamor, of protecting the violation and the desecration of Shabbos. We're in a Zachor mode, which means L'Kadish is a Shabbos. L'Gadol is a Shabbos, L'Kadish is a Shabbos. To make sure that Shabbos is Chemdas Hayomim, is Mivchar Ha'itin Vazmanim. To make sure that Shabbos is designated and singled out as a day of Kedushas Hayom. That's called Zachor. And when we're talking about Shamar, it's V'yanuchu Va. But when we're talking about Zachor, it's V'yanuchu Va. Until we get to Mincha, V'yanuchu Va, in which, as we said before, Rava de Ravin, is Sholtemo Shtei B'chinos Gam Yachad. Shmiras HaShabbos, together with Tchiras Kiddush Hayom. Therefore, Anchilenu Hashem Elokeinu b'Av Haratzon Shabbosos Kodechecha, and that's the highest level at Mincha of Shabbos. And the Rav adds an amazing chiddush about the creation of man. I know this Gemara from Masechta Ksubos, but it also appears apparently in Masechta Brachos. A statement of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah says that man was created male and female in one body. Du partsufim, bara kodesh baruch hu es adam harishon. And he quotes a pasuk to prove that man was called kedem and female achar, two parts of the human body facing in opposite directions. The Gemara says, Laman the Omer partsuf haiminayu sagi bereisha. Which one of these two faces, like Siamese twins, would go forward, face Kadima? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, I would guess, based on logic, that it's Gavra. It's the male that was Beresha, and the female took up the Acha. Yisanya, lo yahalich odom achorei isha, a man should not walk behind a woman. Says Rav Soloveitchik, that what does this mean? Ikar atafke shel isha b'chinas achar lishmar es hamisoris v'es ha'avar, to protect the tradition and the transmission of Torah from the past, to protect all the madregos, all the levels of sanctity that we've achieved, make sure that no one desecrates those levels. Aval tafkido shel ha'ish b'chinas kedem darko shel ish lichbosh. He's going out to conquer new territory. Derech Hadosha, who kovech mechadesh darchei avoda, to expand the boundaries of kedusha. Ligdol ulis alos beli gvul umida. That's what the pasuk means. Zachor v'kedem tzirtani miloshen surah hadu partsufim shnei tafkidim. In this world, there are two different responsibilities, contributions, and roles to play each for each other in building a world of spirituality for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'shtei bechinos elu ba'olama shel Shabbos hem Zachor VeShamor. And the shleimus ultimately is the integration of both when they get together as one entity, and therefore Zachor VeShamor b'dibur. Now from here, a few words of introduction, we move on to page 194, which is Siman Samaches. Again, I just want to present the problem, the issue that we want to address, and in Mitzvah Hashem, we will pick it up next Wednesday. In the sugya of malachos, in Klal Gadol, Ayin Gimel, the Gemara says that very often we have an Av and Toldos. For example, in Zoreah, we have Notea, Mavrich, Markiv, all belong to Melecha Zoreah. Planting, and then what they did was Mavrich, they would bend over a branch of an existing tree, and then it would grow in the ground, and Markiv is where they would add a full tree and attach it to another tree, or a full branch. And Tosefes says that when it says Chayav Mishum Zoreah, it could mean, again, Tosefes is going to argue against this, but he presents a cogent view, and it's the view of many Rishonim, that you have to be Masra a Tolda B'Shem Ha'av. You know that in order for someone to be condemned and liable for violating Shabbos, you must have Eidim V'Asra. The Asra, in the case of Tolda, could be understood in two ways. You could say to the person, don't do Notea because it's a Tolda, meaning, or you could tell him, don't be Zoreah. And it would seem Chayav Michum Zoreah means he's Chayav only if the Hasra was B'Loshen Ha'av. B'tzarech L'Hasos HaTolda Mishum Ha'av. Also says there's no proof. It doesn't say in the Gemara that you have to be Masra him Mishum Ha'av and give him Asra. What the Gemara wants to point out is if you gave Asra B'Shem Ha'av and you mentioned, don't be Zoreah, that is a valid Asra. But there's no requirement to mention the Av. Tosefes at the end of his presentation admits that there's a Gemara elsewhere in Masechta Shabbos that seems to indicate that you have to be Masra on the Tolda B'Shem Ha'av. So basically, just to summarize, there are two different approaches to a Tolda as far as Hasra is concerned. One approach requires that you mention the Av, and the other says you can mention the Av, but there's no need to give Hasra B'Shem Ha'av. you can give the Asra b'Shem a told. Again, you can't give Asra in the name of a different Av. That for sure would undermine and invalidate us. So this essay here, which is Simon Samaches, let's just see how long it is. All right, we won't do all of it, but I want to get an insight because I think in this attempt to understand the machlokas, which seems so technical, it seems secondary, but nothing in halacha is secondary. And you would think, okay, technicality, do you have to mention the Av? You don't have to mention the Av. Can you mention the Av? But Rav Soloveitchik claims that this is perhaps the most important machlokas with regard to Toldos of Shabbos, how to understand what a Tolda is. And that's what I'd like to cover with you, Mirza Hashem, next time. All right, so let me take this opportunity to wish everyone a great week, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Rav.
Okay, best regards.
Kol Tuv.